Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for a recently finished Australian Survivor season. Obviously a pretty massive one here. This would be a player ranking for Australian Survivor versus the world, which you might notice might be coming out a bit differently than how I've done it before, where typically I like to do the season review before I do the player ranking. However, straight up, this is a position where I am very far behind on the review, and I don't know when the review is actually coming out. So again, I'm going to do the player ranking first, and again, the review will be done when it's ready. And at this rate, probably expect the same thing for BB27. But either way, we'll be doing the player ranking here for Australian Survivor versus the world, ranking each player based on how I feel like they played on the season. So that again, we got 14 players to be ranking here. Let's start off at number 14. The bottom of the list was actually a bit of a tough decision, because I actually do feel like there were two very viable candidates for this final spot here. And for most of the season, I was in one specific direction. However, after listening to all the exit press, I do feel like I end up landing in this direction, where at number 14, I do have Rob Bentley. And again, maybe you would expect Rob Bentley to be at the bottom, considering he is the first boot of the season. However, again, immediately after the episode, I actually did not feel extremely down on Rob Bentley. I felt like, well, yes, he did play himself out of what should have been a good position for him. The fact that, again, he had 4 internationals on a tribe of 7, to where he should have had the majority there, and it kind of blew up in his face. I feel like I at least credited him for, again, having the right idea on what to do in the game. I do think, again, that was probably the optimal way for him to navigate through the game, probably the optimal way for the other internationals to navigate through the game. So again, I do think strategically, I don't necessarily think what he was doing was the wrong idea. And even then, I think he was disfavored a bit from not knowing the Parvati-Sarik connection, just how close they were, to where I think that also led to him making some suboptimal plays, particularly around how he handled Parvati. So again, initially I came out of the first few episodes thinking that there was going to be another person at the bottom spot, especially because the other person played really bad. But I ended up going with Rob Bentley at the bottom here for, again, multiple reasons. One, again, he is obviously the first boot of the season. He is someone that was voted out unanimously amongst his tribe mates, even in spots where people like Cass and people like Tommy did want him around initially, only for them to find him too domineering and vote him out. Lisa is also someone that seemingly just was very anti-Rob from the very beginning. Didn't like the way that he talked to his allies, to where, again, it does seem like Rob probably did more actively wrong than what I initially expected, to where, again, Rob's someone that here that was the first boot of his tribe in a spot where he probably should never be the first boot. Again, it's kind of mind-blowing still that Rob Bentley was the first boot of Australian Survivor vs. the World. Again, a series that takes so much physicality, and from the vote out their strongest guy right from the beginning is still kind of insane. And again, I think that's something you have to dock against Rob Bentley as well, to where ultimately, again, Rob Bentley, I do think was still harmed by his lack of Survivor knowledge, but it does seem like he did enough actively wrong outside that to still be at the bottom of the list here, number 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to the person who I thought was going to be at the bottom of this list, because I think this person played horribly on this season. Yeah, I guess good enough to be above Rob Bentley, and that person is George. And again, George is in this weird spot in this season where, again, he was screwed. He had no chance on this season, where obviously he had a massive reputation, but even beyond that, had no allies coming into the season. He really had probably one of the worst possible returnee tribes for him, having most of the tribe being connected to Luke and David, who are seemingly against him from the very beginning, to where, again, I think George was screwed on this season, to where, again, we'll have another player that I think was also screwed that would be higher on the list. However, I think the difference here is that I do think that person played more optimally than George, where George is someone that I think played just a really messy game the entire season. I mean, it was really a spot where, yes, he does survive that first tribal, but really by accident. Like, in reality, he was kind of messing up the plan that was trying to save him, where it should have been a very clean cut David vote, but he keeps on trying to save David in a spot where David's trying to get him out. And I feel like that's obviously very sloppy there, and again, gets saved seemingly at the whim of Kirby at the last second, just deciding to save him. It did seem like George was going home for most of that round and kind of gets saved again due to nothing that he actively did, and then he proceeds to just get voted out the following round in a spot where he's also blindsided somehow in that spot. For a while, again, I do think George was very screwed on this season. I don't think there's a single thing George did actively right on this season. I think he just made some very bizarre strategic calls along the way. Also just was very ineffective in getting what he wanted done, to where ultimately, again, I felt like this was a pretty bad showing from George. So again, I have him here at number 13. Now, number 12, moving on to, again, probably the person you would have expected to be next anyway. We got David, who is someone that obviously did get voted out over George. And this is something that I think you can maybe debate a bit more. However, again, my debate with that is that I feel like George, again, did nothing to actually save himself during the David vote. While David, again, at least when he got voted out, had 2 loyal allies by his side. Now, I think the major thing to criticize here for David is, again, kind of in that Rob Bentley mold, that there's no reason he should have been the first boot from his tribe. Again, he is the most physical person on his tribe. Mind you, I do think taking out Rob probably gave them permission to take out David. Now that the other tribe also is lacking its most physical player, but it's still a spot here where David came into this game with so many connections. Again, he literally was connected to over half this tribe. Again, he had a friendship from Sarah that went before Survivor. He had Luke, his number 1 ally from his first season. He has Janine, who, while ended on rocky terms on their original season, later went on to do The Apprentice with her, and they were clearly friends. He had previously played with Shawnee, and while, again, that relationship wasn't great, again, at least that was a connection there. And even with Kirby, I mean, Kirby is someone that had a connection to Luke, who was his number 1 ally, to where, again, on paper, there's no reason for David to be the first boot of this tribe, which is something that I think you can knock here for sure. I do think he definitely faltered in terms of trying to get Kirby on board. Also, he squandered his relationship with Sarah, which should have been a locked-in ally for him, to where, and there's definitely things he did wrong here. Yeah, again, I do think in comparison to George, again, at least he did have allies. At least there was at least a chance that he was going to survive that first round. And I just don't think he played as actively poorly as George did, to where I do feel like David, again, definitely squandered what should have been a very good position for him, but I still think he played better than George and Rob here. So again, he's here at number 12. Now, number 11, moving back to more of a player that I think did a lot actively wrong in the game, but did make it deeper into the game, but still someone that I think there's a lot of criticisms to be had of this person's game, and that person is Sarah. And Sarah, to me, came off very disappointing on this season. As well, Sarah was a very messy player her first time around. I thought with more life experience, coming back years later, that she would actually be able to play a more stable game, and she probably plays an even more messy game this time around. But what's frustrating about it is that it's under the guise of her trying to play this loyal game, that she tries to remain loyal to Kirby to her own detriment. She votes out David, one of her best connections coming into this season, at the first vote to appease Kirby, someone she has no connection with, only to then proceed to flip on Kirby in a spot where Janine and Luke, who she's flipping to, don't even want to work with her and proceed to decide to work with Kirby over her. It seemed like Sarah would have potentially been the next to go had that tribe ever gone to tribal again. There's a chance that if she does not win immunity and her tribe went to tribal there's a chance Sarah definitely goes home in that spot. And that's followed up by her proceeding to just get voted out at the merge anyway, which it feels like a full ramification of her flipping on Kirby to begin with, to where I really just feel like she made all the wrong decisions on this season, where I just think her entire plan of working with Kirby over David was something that was just so misguided from the offset, and it really just tanked her entire game, to where, to be fair, I think she was kind of screwed once she got rid of David to begin with, but again, her also then proceeding to backtrack from that and then put an even bigger bullseye on her back because of that. Again, I just think at the end of the day, I just do not think she made the correct strategic decisions throughout this entire season, which is ultimately why she lands here at number 11. Now, number 10. Now moving on to a player here that this might be a bit of an unpopular opinion that this person is so low. Yeah, genuinely, I don't think this player played particularly well, or at least was very ineffective in the game. And at number 10, I do have Shawnee. And again, this is a bit of a weird placement considering Shawnee obviously makes it to 5th place. So again, her being as low as number 10 here is a bit strange, though I think there's a couple things to justify this. First, in the fact that it does seem like Shawnee was likely to go had they actually went to tribal in the round 4, which they thought was about to happen, which again seems like which essentially feels like her being saved by a last second twist there. Also getting saved by like a random rock draw that made Sari do fire for the World Tribe in a spot where probably almost anybody else beat Sarah in that fire making challenge. Where I think Shawnee got very lucky to even make it to the merge to begin with. And even then, I don't think Shawnee was playing particularly well. Now, I know that she came into the game with this specific strategy that she wanted to play by herself and that she wanted to be this kind of lone wolf and didn't want to be targeted due to having a number 1 ally, and I get that strategy. However, I do feel like she was fairly ineffective in the game despite that. I mean, we do see her really being at the whim of Kirby early on in the game, where, to be fair, again, there was definitely some lack of pregame connections that were involved with that, but to be fair, Kirby didn't have that many pregame connections either, and actually didn't even utilize the one that she did have with Luke. So she really just goes along with what Kirby wants to do first for a few rounds, and while obviously she gets credit for finally getting her revenge on George, it's not really a spot where I even think that was the correct move for her to get rid of George at that specific point, and the vote ended up being split on her as a potential backup anyway. And we get to the merge where she votes out Sarah, which I get on paper. Again, I do think the notion of taking out Sarah, for Shawnee in particular, who has no connection to Sarah, they were actively going against each other. Again, I do think that is something that I at least get on paper. However, the problem is that she simply did not have the setup to pull off the move she needed to do after that move, where following that move, she really needs to be able to pick up the internationals and take the shot against Sri and Parvati, which supposedly she was trying to do, but was just so ineffective in doing so. Again, her trying to flip the ball into Sri at the final 9 round, and just no one gets on board with that outside of Luke. And by the time of the final 8, we obviously see the Australians get one over on the internationals, but the problem is that she's on the bottom of that pecking order. Again, she's outside of the core group that is Parvati, Sri, Janine, and Luke, and is kind of just being led to the slaughter at that point. It doesn't really even do anything from that point forward, just votes with the majority, doesn't really take a shot in a spot where she should have still taken that shot and potentially saved Tommy at the final 7. And I just feel like overall, Shawnee's game is just very lackluster by the end. It's one where, again, I think she was saved early on in the game. She also just had very little agency throughout most of the game, and kind of just goes out in a whimper, to where ultimately I don't feel like Shawnee's game was that good on this season. She's here number 10. Now number 9. At number 9, we're moving on to a player that, and you might say is too high on this list, yet I feel like this person legitimately just did nothing actively wrong and was just kind of screwed just based on the layout on the game. And at number 9, I do have Toni. And again, is there some bias here for Toni on this list? Maybe. But also, I legitimately don't think Toni did that much actively wrong. Now, again, you can criticize maybe getting rid of Rob Bentley at that first vote, as obviously that led to the women just having a more outright majority and gave them more incentive to work together. But really, it's a spot here where you can say the same thing about the U.S. players as well. And really, I think it's such a credit to Toni, the fact that he was never even mentioned as a potential target for that first vote. And again, to be fair, there was maybe some gender biases in play that they think Toni's better in challenges. But I still do think the fact that Toni, again, a 2-time winner with such a big reputation, doesn't even get mentioned as a potential target for that first vote is pretty insane. And I think something about Toni on this season is that I actually feel better about Toni as a player coming out of this season, where Toni is a player here that I think coming out of Winners at War, while he played, again, an extremely dominant game on that season, also played a very dominant game in Cagayan, I think his Game Changers run was something that, again, made it a little bit questionable if how he would do on most given seasons. I think on A vs. the World here, again, while it didn't end up well, again, he's still the 4th boot of the season, I do think he's demonstrated his ability to really replicate that strategy again, that he was able to go under the radar, the fact that he was able to and play that Winners at War strategy, and again, I do think that for me actually elevates my opinion of him as a player. That I feel like the Winners at War version of Toni is the actual version of Toni we would be seeing on most given Survivor seasons nowadays, and actually elevate my opinion of him as a player. Now, on this season in particular, again, it's really just tough to truly dock too much from the season, concerning, again, I just think he was kind of screwed to begin with. Where, again, yeah, he should have maybe secured relationships with the likes of Lisa and Cass maybe a bit more. Maybe that would have potentially saved him. But ultimately, they really had no other option, where they don't have any real incentive to get rid of their own naturally baked-in number in Tommy and give the U.S. players a majority. They have no real incentive to be doing that. Oh, well, Parvati and Sri obviously have a pre-game connection where they're going to be looking out for each other more than him. Oh, well, also, again, we have this all-women's thing. And again, there were just so many things here working against Toni, along with the fact that also he was, in a way, twist-screwed by the end. Again, in a way, the fact that there even was this twist that made it so there was a fire-making challenge to decide who goes to Tribal was something that does feel a bit wonky, where if it was a more traditional immunity challenge, we had been seeing the World Tribe winning a lot of the normal immunity challenges, where there's a good shot if it was a normal round that the World Tribe would just win immunity and Toni would make it to the merge, and who knows what happens at that point. Considering I think he could definitely link up with the Australians, and I know Sarah in particular was talking about how she really wanted to work with Toni, to where, again, I do think it's a spot here where, while not a great placement here for Toni, I do actually feel pretty good about Toni coming out of this season. I feel like he really demonstrated that he's able to do what he did in Winners at War again, of kind of like lay low until the time is right. And again, I obviously respect the fact that he at least tried at the end, the fact that he had this shoe idol and tried to do something there. And again, I just feel like Toni didn't do that much actively wrong on this season. For me, that's good enough to put him here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that made it a bit deeper into the game, but also kind of just in and out of the majority, never really had a true footing in the game, but also had some potential in the game as well. At number 8, we do have Tommy. And Tommy is a player here that sadly was kind of just on the bottom the entire season. I mean, once Rob Bentley ends up going, he's again just kind of on the bottom with Toni, where the women seem to come together on that tribe, and it was either him or Toni the entire time. Well, obviously, he ends up being saved over Toni. I don't know how much of that was from actively good work Tommy did, and more so just, again, the baked-in tribe dynamics of them not wanting to give the U.S. more numbers, and him just having this initial bond, obviously, with the other internationals. But I do think the Rob move in particular is something that is really bad for Tommy. I think it's actually the worst for Tommy, where it's like a move that just like puts him on the bottom. So again, I think that's definitely a bad call there. And then we get to the merge where obviously he has his international contingent, and it felt like that group was somewhat solidified together. At least we see them voting together. I know like Tommy talked about like not really trusting Cass, but still it's like we do have him being involved in like the Kirby vote off, and we at least see him again try to make a move by the time the Cass vote, to where again that would have been the correct call to make. Now, again, he was still ineffective in doing so, and that's still a criticism here, and the fact that he was not able to convince Cass and Lisa to go through with it. And even if he did, it seemed like Luke and Janine were not on board either, to where ultimately, again, it doesn't seem like he was particularly close to making that move go through. Yeah, though I do respect the fact that he at least tried to make that move, and I do think it was the correct call for his game. And I think even by the time he goes home, again, in the double tribal of it all, like, it's a spot where I think he was making a very accurate pitch. Like, I do think he had a correct read on the game by that point and was making a pitch that should have worked and was making a pitch that made a lot of logical sense, just no one really cared. To where Tommy's actually a player here that I think actually played maybe the most optimally for more of the season than a lot of the other players on the board, especially the next couple that we'll be talking about. However, it's also a spot here where he was just so ineffective in the game and was not really able to get anything he wanted done. There really isn't a true point in this season where he actively tries to do something and it actually goes through. Now, again, I will definitely give him a bit of credit in the sense that I do think Tommy came into this game with, again, a massive disadvantage, both in the fact that, again, he's not a native English speaker, and obviously that leads to a language barrier there. Also, beyond that, had a bad draw from a tribe perspective, where, again, he's on minority gender-wise, and a lot of the women on this tribe were very apt to be working together, where, again, definitely not a great landing spot here for Tommy, but ultimately, again, I do think he just ended up being very ineffective in the game. So for me, he's here at number 8. Now, number 7, moving on to a player that I think is a bit tough to rank, because I think there's a portion of this person's game that is very good, but then there's a portion of this person's game that's very bad. Yeah, I think the fact that they were so effective for part of the game is what lands him this high. At number 7, I do have Kirby. And again, Kirby is someone that I think for the first half of the game was probably playing the best game. I think Kirby plays a pretty insane pre-merge game here, one where, despite the fact that she came into this season having almost no connections, not knowing who any of these people are, I mean, their only connection she really had coming into this season was Luke, and even then, she doesn't even actually work with Luke, and was still able to get her way throughout the entire pre-merge phase is kind of insane. I mean, the fact that she was able to lead this vote against David, get Sarah, a actual friend of David for years, to flip on him is, again, just kind of insane. And it's also 100% the correct move for Kirby. Again, getting rid of David, someone who is this big linchpin on the other side, really just opens up the game for Kirby in a way that, again, I think that was a very impressive move there for her to be able to pull that off. And while obviously it pisses off Sarah, it's a spot where somehow she actually still ends up getting one better on Sarah, where we see Luke and Janine decide to side with Kirby over Sarah, which is just kind of insane, where it felt like Kirby was really going to be that decision maker at round 4 if they had gone the tribal properly, where it felt like Sarah was going home, actually not won immunity, and then it would have been Shawnee after that, because again, that's what Kirby wanted. And again, I think Kirby like really dominates that pre-merge phase of the game, only to then completely blow up her game at the merge. And it's kind of what ends up being this very frustrating game here from Kirby, and the fact that I think once she gets to the merge, yes, obviously she leads the vote against Sarah, and again, there are reasons to be taking out Sarah at that point. However, I don't think she made the right call for her game, and it feels like at that point she kind of just decided to simp for Parvati. And again, I think you give a lot of credit to Parvati for that, but I still think it's a spot here where Kirby just completely blows up her game at the merge here and really tanks all the goodwill she had up to that point. Again, flipping on Luke and Janine and really all the Australians to take out Sarah, only to then proceed to be taken out the following round by the people that she flipped to. And again, it's just a very bad exit from the game there, to where, again, Kirby's someone that definitely had some strong suits, definitely played probably the best game coming into the merge, but then just completely sinks that positioning so unnecessarily after merge that, again, it makes it a bit tough to really rank her as a player. But ultimately here, again, I am going to land her here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that I know caused a lot of frustrations online. A lot of people were not really happy with this person and how they played. Yet ultimately, I don't think this player played that poorly of a game until the telltale end, and that player is Lisa. And Lisa here is someone that, despite the fact that, again, people were very frustrated at her wanting to quit, and again, she definitely made some questionable moves of her telling Luke and Janine to vote for Parvati, which I still don't understand the rationale for that move. Outside of that, I feel like Lisa's game is actually kind of solid on this season, considering her placement. It's one where, again, she was in a major swing position early on in the game. She really was his main decision maker on taking out Rob during that first vote, where she was really this linchpin between the internationals and the U.S. players, where, again, I do debate if taking out Rob was the right move, where I personally don't. I think the right move would have been her taking out Tony. Ultimately, again, I do think she technically led that vote and then proceeds to get her way at the following vote as well, where her and Cass are able to get Tony out, which is very beneficial for them in particular, again, allowing them to have Tommy coming into the merge and being this pretty big voting block coming into the merge, where ultimately we don't really see them really make the most of that. But it put Lisa in a pretty powerful position following that, to where while at the final 10, we do see them not really having much agency there. At the final 9, we do see them getting Parvati and Sri back on board to take out Kirby and really having a lot of options at that point, where ultimately, again, they kind of squander it by not really picking up Luke and Janine early enough, and Parvati ends up flipping on them, which, again, you could definitely attribute to poor play from Lisa. The fact that Parvati seemed to see Lisa's conversation with Luke and Janine, and that be the reason why she decided to do what she did. And also, we do see her, again, turning down this move to flip against Parvati, where supposedly by the time of Tribal, that move wasn't happening anyway, which, again, makes her telling Luke and Janine the plan even more questionable. But it's still a spot where, again, I think there definitely was some sloppy play by the time we get to the final 8. But I do think her game up to that point was just kind of a solid game where she's kind of in the middle, got her way at points. And even following that, I actually don't think her final round is that bad. I think she was just kind of screwed to begin with and didn't really have many legs there, to where I do think she was making rational arguments. Just, again, no one was willing to take the shot against Parvati at that point. And I do think it's a spot here where Lisa, again, ends up being fairly ineffective towards the back portion of her game, but again, was pretty effective early on in the game. And again, outlasted Kirby, voted out Kirby. I think there is a debate between her and Kirby. I do think the fact that she outlasts her here is really winds up landing her here at number 6. Now, number 5, essentially just a slightly better version of Lisa, despite the fact that she didn't make it as far. We have Cass. My overall opinion of Cass as a player after this season probably does go up, where Cass is someone that, again, I watched on Survivor Quebec, and while she was solid on that season, I don't feel like she really had that killer instinct on that season, and I feel like we at least got to see a little bit more of that on this season, her, like, openly distrusting Parvati, and while, again, she never really makes the move for that, and I think, again, it's still a flaw, the fact that I think she waits a bit too long to make that move. I do think we saw a little bit more of a killer instinct on her appearance here than her first time around, and just in general, again, I think Cass ends up being one of the better players of this season. Again, what we just talked about Lisa kind of applies to Cass as well. Again, Cass was also in a pretty solid position. Mind you, I think Lisa was probably more of a central piece of that first vote than Cass was, where Cass was more so just a tag along by the end, but I think Cass seemingly was more effective during the Tony boot round and was more actively getting her way there. Ozzy gets taken out the final 8 in a very wonky vote, where that was one that seemingly came together at the last second, and also a spot where it seemed like Lisa was the initial target for that round, only from the flip the vote onto Cass, literally at Tribal, which I do think was 100% the correct call for Parvati, but I think, again, something I will at least give her credit for is that the majority of that tribe did not intend on targeting her to begin with. Also, beyond that, I will give a lot of credit to Cass for the fact that I think she was probably the most likely to win of any of the internationals. I feel like despite the fact that they came into this season with no reputation, no one knew who they were, no one had any built-in respect for them, I feel like Cass leaves the season with a lot of respect, and I feel like she is the most likely to win a jury vote had they gotten to the end. Along the fact that I feel like Cass doesn't do that much actively wrong to cause her elimination. I feel like it was more so the things that were happening around her. And obviously, again, you still criticize her for not stopping those things, or, again, building enough trust with Parvati to get her to trust her more in that position. But I do feel like in terms of the strategic decision making, I don't fault her as much, even though, again, she should be making the move on Parvati at that point. And it definitely is a flaw that she didn't really lock in Luke and Janine before Parvati and Suri did. Now, I know some people will probably dock her for how she plays the idol and that Parvati was able to trick her in that spot, which, I mean, fair, but also I do think her being sprung up on with this knowledge is power last second, something that they didn't even know existed in Australian Survivor up to this point, is something I'll give her a little bit of grace for. Also, the fact that she technically didn't get tricked in the sense that she was going to play the idol for Lisa anyway, and to be fair, that's more of a poor read on her, that she thought the votes were on Lisa instead of her, but still, it's a spot where, again, you can definitely qualm with how she played her idol there, but it's something I don't really dock too much from her, especially amongst the people that are around her on the list here. Where, again, also like Tommy, again, she did come into the game, obviously, with the language barrier, and again, she did come in with a majority of women, where, again, it's not as bad of a position as Tommy was in, but I do think she really made the most of it, and ended up playing, again, a solid game that just has her being kind of sniped out at the very end here. So, again, for me, I do have her here number 5. And number 4, and number 4 is a player here that I actually don't think played particularly well in this season. I think this is, by far, their least impressive showing. Yeah, I feel like it's still a spot here where they did end up outlasting everyone else we've talked about so far and seemingly had a modicum of win equity. And at number 4, I do have Luke. And again, Luke is someone that I think played fairly suboptimally throughout this entire season. I think he's someone that was on the bottom for a lot of the season. Once he finally got into power, he also made the wrong decisions once he got into power. And I feel like Luke's game on this season is kind of frustrating in that sense, in the sense that I don't feel like he was actively playing to win the game. It felt like he was more so playing just to get to the end, with the assumption that he would win the game if he got to the end, seemingly just because he's Luke, and he just assumes that he'll win if he gets to the end, which again has been the case the last couple seasons that he's played. But again, this is a season where he's on the show with Parvati and Cirie and these bigger names that simply, again, I think Luke just very much underestimated how much win equity the other people would have, that led to him playing a very boring game. And one where he's also just, again, on the bottom for the entire beginning of the game. He's aloof when David goes home. He is able to recover a bit when George goes home and finds Sarah, again, wanting to work with him at that point, only for him to then go and turn on Sarah to work with Kirby, which I don't think was the right call. He gets to the merge, where again he's blindsided when Sarah ends up going home there, fails to keep the Australians together. He then ends up being kind of blindsided when Kirby goes home. I know Janine said in post-game press that she didn't actually tell Luke what was going on there, but it's still a spot where, again, Luke was technically not supposed to be involved in that plan, in a plan that is getting rid of somebody that Luke himself had threw out her name earlier in the round. So again, that's not great. And then we get to the final 8 round, where I actually do think he plays pretty well. I think that's probably his best played round of the game, where he was able to build a 4% alliance with Parvati, Cirie, and Janine that they actually stayed loyal to, which I think is impressive, and is able to get Parvati and Cirie to turn against the internationals. And again, I think all that is good on paper and definitely was the right call for his game. The problem is that he doesn't do anything with that, where I think the following move in taking out Tommy is just completely the wrong move, where again, the move should have been to get Parvati to turn to internationals, only then to turn on Parvati, Cirie immediately after that. And I think the fact that he didn't do that, seemingly based around a misconception around his win equity, again, I think is bad. And again, he takes out Tommy, and while he then proceeds to take out Lisa, which isn't the worst thing in the world for him, as Lisa wasn't with him, it's still a spot where, again, I think he kind of squandered the potential to use Lisa as a number. And again, it's still going deep into the game with Parvati and Cirie, where, again, him letting go Shani at 5, I think is really bad. And again, at least credit to him, the fact that he was able to keep Janine on his side, though she didn't flip on him at the final 4, but it's still a spot where he was drawing dead by that point anyway. Again, he can't beat Parvati, who he's going to the end with either way at that point. And again, maybe he can beat Cirie, but even that, I don't think so. And again, it's just a spot where he was just kind of playing for a loss for a lot of the season. Now, again, within it, there are some individual good plays. Again, the final 8, I still think is pretty well played from him. I think him getting Parvati to tear up her advantage, that's kind of insane as well, even though, again, he didn't really do anything with that. To where, again, I think there is some decent play within that. And it did seem like he had some win equity. I mean, it does seem like Cirie was like leaving the game talking about like Luke obviously wins if he gets to the end. To where, again, it seemed like people on the island at least did think that Luke had a serious chance at winning a jury vote. So again, that's at least something. But again, he just ultimately does not beat Parvati, and I don't think he seemed to be particularly close either. To where ultimately, again, I think Luke plays a fairly lackluster game, a game where he just seemed to be playing it safe and never really made the move he needed to do to win the game, and that's ultimately why I have him here at number 4. Now, number 3, we're moving on to a player that I'm actually surprised at how high they are on this list. We're coming into the season, I was not really expecting much from this player. However, I think they ultimately played one of the best games of the season, and that player is Janine. And Janine's actually probably one of the most integral players to how this season plays out, and especially in how she was able to build that bond with Parvati and Cirie, is probably the most integral piece of that end game that actually made everything happen, and probably to her detriment, as again, I don't think she was winning at the end. But again, the thing is, like, I don't know if Janine was winning against anybody at the end of the season. It just seemed like it was naturally accepted that Janine was kind of a GOAT at the end, and I don't think anyone really gave Janine the time of day to win a jury vote. So that's an issue, obviously, the fact that she has no win equity, but I think her navigation through the game is stronger than Luke's. It's essentially Luke's, but better. Again, I think she was more influential in the game. I think she was able to get Parvati and Cirie to be loyal to her. I think she also played very well from a self-preservation standpoint. I mean, her having Cirie and Parvati never realized that she was against them at 4, to where, again, they couldn't turn the vote on her. I think tricking 2 of the best Survivor players of all time. Now, I'll say early game, I do think is rocky. Obviously, she's on the bottom when David goes home. And again, she's in the same position as Luke following that. Though again, she gets one up on Luke, and the fact that at the merge, I do think she was obviously very integral to the Kirby vote coming together, and was more integral to the piecing together of that majority alliance that runs the game of Parvati, Cirie, Luke, and Janine. And again, I think Janine plays a very strong game. In the back portion of it, the problem is not a winning game. It's not a game that would ever give her the win, especially against those that she was up against. However, I do think she was very influential in getting that end game to happen. And again, I think in comparison to Luke, again, I think she was a lot more effective in the game. And for me personally, I think she played the better game than Luke, undeniably, to where ultimately, again, I just feel like Janine plays a fairly strong end game, especially in terms of getting to the end, and not even in a like Luke style way where, again, I feel like Luke was making very suboptimal plays that didn't even matter his position, as again, he was still in the spot where, again, he needed to go to fire if he went to 4, which again, he obviously was confident going to do, but again, it's still a spot where his end game was a lot more precarious than Janine's, with Janine also just having so much more agency in that back portion of the game, to where, while again, the beginning of her game is rocky, in comparison to Luke, I do think she's better than Luke here, so again, she's here at number 3. Now number 2, and the top 2 should be fairly obvious, and it also should be fairly obvious the order as well. However, at number 2, I am going to go with Cirie. And Cirie has a very weird game to assess on this season, as it's one where there was so much potential. And I think Cirie was actually playing the best game of this season up until the final 8. I think up to that point, Cirie played a pretty flawless game. Again, it's a game where, obviously, again, she had some things benefiting her. Again, her built-in relationship with Parvati, her having Lisa, who was someone that was going to simp for her. Again, there definitely were some benefits there. However, again, I think she plays extremely well using those benefits. Again, she's able to get the internationals to turn against Rob Bentley, form a Black Widow Brigade 2.0, a Black Widow Brigade that she's the best positioned in. Again, the other members, and Cass and Lisa, did not trust Parvati, but they trusted Cirie. And that's something that definitely props her up here, is the fact that I think Cirie was the best positioned player within that group for a good chunk of the game. And again, her keeping around the internationals is something that is so much more beneficial to her than it is for Parvati. And again, I do think up until that final 8 round, I do think she was playing better than Parvati was on this season. However, I do think it turns around at the final 8 in a spot where I do think she starts to sacrifice her own game for Parvati. And again, this is just a criticism of really both Cirie and Parvati by the end. But again, I think both of them were just so undyingly loyal to each other, wanted to go to the end against each other, even though that was not the best case scenario for either of them. But obviously, it's worse for Cirie because Cirie seems to lose against Parvati. Parvati had the flashier game that would likely win more jury votes. And I feel like Cirie kind of sacrificed her game because she wanted to get to the end of Parvati, which is just kind of a shame to see here, as it kind of leads to her just kind of sabotaging her own positioning and taking out the likes of Cass, the likes of Lisa eventually, in spots where they were very integral numbers for her getting to a final 5, where by that point she's essentially a dead man walking, because at that point she's either going to the end of Parvati where she will lose, or she's set up to lose in fire making at 4 because Parvati's so obviously going to win the final 4 immunity challenge, and Cirie will be the reciprocate of that, to where again, it's just kind of a frustrating game by the end, as I feel like Cirie did not really live up to her full potential here, with her kind of just giving up her game for this notion of going to the end of Parvati by the end of the game, which is obviously something that just doesn't benefit her. And now, again, despite that, the rest of her game is fairly solid. Again, it's a game where she was really running the game alongside Parvati and got what she wanted at a lot of opportunities. Again, not in the tail end, but still, it is a fairly impressive game. And if she were to somehow get to the end without Parvati and win a jury vote, it would have been a very strong winning game. But again, it is just the frustration of the fact that she had Parvati, who's just so much more outwardly a bigger threat and someone that would clearly have more respect from the jury, and she just simply just never makes that move against her. And again, there's obviously some preseason, and obviously there's a massive pregame relationship that factors into that, but it's still a spot where, again, I just think there's not really much of an argument here for Cirie being number 1 by the end, especially with her just kind of sabotaging her own game for Parvati by the end. So again, I do have her here number 2. Now number 1, it's pretty undeniable. It's not even close. At number 1, I obviously have Parvati Shallow. And Parvati's game on this season was extremely impressive. This is definitely one of the best winning games of any Survivor season ever. Again, Parvati played one of the most impressive games here, running the show from beginning to end, having no point where she was any true direct danger, where I very much would consider her game here very similar to that of Tony's Winners at War game. And again, there's some nuances there that are slightly different between the two, but again, both of them had a built-in number 1 ally that they ran the show with, that they were undyingly loyal to, that they got to the end while running the entire show the entire season. Obviously, Tony did probably a little bit more to undercut Sarah than what Parvati did, but I do feel like Parvati's game here, again, is very impressive. again, especially against a pretty high caliber cast here, to where I think we really just saw the fully developed version of Parvati. It just really felt like a return of the heroes versus villain style Parvati that we saw in the past, but one that actually went on to win this time. And again, I think Parvati's game here, very impressive and undeniably the best of the season. Again, there's not really a question. That being said, I think there are some qualms to be had here. Again, I think there were still some like strategic decisions that I still question. Again, I think the decision to tell Rob Bentley about Deal or No Deal Island just felt unnecessary and something that could just blow up in her face. I guess she was trying to build trust there, but I don't think that was the right call in that position. It also seems like she was never really able to truly gel with the likes of Lisa and Cass, with them always trusting Cirie more than her. I think that's something to criticize. I think she kind of blew up her relationship with Tony and wasn't really able to secure him well enough and wasn't able to get her way and wanting to keep Tony around, which is also a criticism there. I think she does very good work at the merge and is able to get Kirby on side, and they take out Sarah, which I think was the right move for her, but then she proceeds to take out Kirby in a spot where Kirby was undyingly loyal to her, and I feel like that's another position where probably not the ideal for her game. And even at the final 8, when she makes the move against the internationals, it's technically based around a bad read, and I don't think it was necessarily the wrong call, as I think Cass is really her only competition in the final immunity challenge, is someone that she didn't trust anyway, and Cass herself didn't trust her, to where, again, I don't think it's the wrong call to be making that move, but it technically was a call made based on a incorrect read, that Cass and Lisa were voting for her, which they weren't by that point. So obviously we have her bluff with her advantage at that point, which, I mean, the fact that she even had the advantage to begin with is obviously very luck-based, but still, I do feel like she bluffed extremely well in that position, even though, again, she's admitted herself that, again, it was not really purposeful at first, where she kind of forgot that final part, but then once she realized that, she bluffed extremely well, and again, she was able to utilize it to her benefit, and again, I think it was pretty impressive, the fact that she was not voted out at the final 7, where I feel like, and obviously, again, there was very little time to really talk through things to where that probably benefited her, but again, I don't think the shot would have been taken anyway from Luke and Janine, so I think that's very impressive, and we obviously having her tearing up her advantage with Luke, which again, I also think is questionable. Not necessarily the wrong call, considering Luke did remain loyal, but just a spot where I probably would have done the opposite. I probably just wouldn't have done it and then used the power against Luke and taken him out. But again, it's not really that big of a deal, as again, we do have Luke sticking with her at 5, and I do think she plays the idol playing situation effectively. Again, the fact that she really kind of strong arms Luke into playing the idol, not on Shawnee in that spot, which obviously was a very awkward interaction, but again, I think she plays that very well, and I feel like those are like sort of things that Parvati does pretty effectively in the game, as I do think she's very good at those style of interactions where she's trying to goad someone into doing something. Now, mind you, I do question her Final Four positioning, where I know Janina said in post-game press that she would have voted for Parvati if Parvati was not immune, that she did want to go to the end of Cirie over Parvati. I feel like that's something to, again, definitely criticize. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think Parvati was ever losing that final immunity challenge. I don't think she would lose almost any final immunity challenge in Australian Survivor, which again is probably more of just a broken aspect of the Australian Survivor format, but it's still a spot where, again, Parvati just fundamentally wins these style of endurance challenges against almost anybody, and I feel like it's a spot here where Parvati was just so clearly going to win this final immunity to where it didn't really matter, but again, it's a spot where if she had not won that immunity, she could have potentially been in danger, again, gone to fire against Luke. Who knows, maybe she beats Luke, but definitely a spot where I don't know if her Final Four positioning was ideal. I think, like, I kind of get why she took out Lisa, but still would have had 2 chances to save herself, as again, she always had Cirie by her side, and then again, Cirie was always going to be a loyal number to her. Mind you, again, definitely very beneficial, the fact that she had Cirie on this season to begin with, and also even beyond that, I do think it's still a criticism for me, the fact that she was undyingly loyal to Cirie, in a spot where I don't think she did that much actively to try to really get one up on Cirie. Again, in comparison to Tony with Sarah in Winners at War, he had the Sophie move, which is just very, like, blatant undercutting of Sarah, while also just such a beneficial move for Tony, where I don't feel like Parvati really has that here. If anything, it actually is the opposite. I think it's actually, like, again, getting rid of Kirby is something that is so detrimental to Parvati, to where, again, I think that's something to criticize, in the fact that I do think Parvati doesn't really do enough actively to really get one up on Cirie. I assume she probably would have beaten Cirie in a final situation. It does seem like Parvati is probably just the biggest jury threat on the board, which is something to give her credit for, obviously. And at the end of the day, again, she gets to the end, demolishes Luke and Janine in a jury vote, and probably beats almost anybody on this season. And I think that's something to very much prop her up for, to where, again, she's definitively the number 1 on this list. So again, I think there's probably more qualms here than people will typically bring up. I think a lot of people are already talking about this as like a flawless performance. And again, it's a spot where, all things considered, I think this is the best game Parvati has ever played, and I don't even think it's close. I think this is a game where, again, she was in a dominant position from beginning to end, though I don't think she was necessarily the best positioned in the game throughout the entire season, and didn't necessarily get her way the entire season either. Well, also, I think was a bit too blindly loyal to Cirie in a spot where, again, she beats Cirie anyway, but I think that's a criticism as well. And I think at the end of the day, just to get my stance on this out already as well, where obviously, again, after Parvati's win here, there's a lot of talk about how she's the undisputed GOAT of Survivor. I personally still would have Tony won, especially after this season, where I actually feel Tony also improved his legacy, in my opinion, post this season. Now, I do see more of the Winners at War Tony being the real Tony, where I feel like with Parvati, my opinion of Parvati definitely went up. Again, I think she's undisputedly number 2 on my players of all time list now, but it's also a spot here where Parvati, for me personally, just lacks that killer instinct. And I feel like this is something that Parvati's always lacked. And I feel like we just saw it again on this season. The fact that, again, she's not really willing to cut her number 1 ally if necessary. Again, she was not willing to cut Amanda or Cirie in Micronesia, even though she didn't know she would beat them. She was not willing to cut Cirie here. And to be fair, I think with this season in particular, it's less of a flaw, because obviously there's pre-game connections involved in that. But I do think still I go back to how she played Micronesia and the fact that she didn't have that killer instinct there and hasn't really demonstrated after the fact. That I feel like is the main difference for me between her and Tony, where Tony's someone I have a lot more confidence in that he would turn on his closest ally if he knew he was going to win. Where obviously, again, I talked about Winners at War, where again, that's a spot where he technically didn't do that. But again, he did more work to actually make sure he would win against Sarah. Along with also, again, that was post his win and with pregame connections, where there's obviously different incentives there. And again, it's more similar to what happened now with Parvati and Cirie, to where, again, I'll fault them to a degree, but it's not this major ding. But again, I think when going to the GOAT conversation, I think it really comes down to how they played their first time around, so before their wins and before these pregame connections played so much of a factor, that Parvati was not willing to cut Cirie and Amanda in a spot where Tony was willing to cut Wu, was willing to cut Trish if it meant that he won the game, which again, for me, is the main decision maker between the two, even though, again, they're both obviously have major arguments for being the best player of all time. And again, if you want to say Parvati's the best player of all time, I don't have an issue with that. I fully would get justification for that. However, I think for me personally, I would still personally say Tony is better. But again, Parvati also one of the best players of all time. Very impressive on this season. Really just demonstrated that she still has that game in her, if not even better than what she had before. Considering, again, I think this is her best appearance by miles, to where ultimately, again, Parvati by far the number 1 on this ranking here. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for AU versus the World. As mentioned before, again, the season review, I'm working on it. When it will be out, I could not tell you. It'll be out when it's done. I'm not that deep into working on it straight up, to where I end up making a Survivor Guatemala retrospective that took way too long. Just in general, I'm really far behind on videos, and I already made my statement on that. Again, videos probably going to be slowing down coming into next month, just because it's been a struggle to really keep up with things at this point. And again, for the sake of my mental health, I think it's better I don't even really try to do 2 videos a week at this point. But again, we'll see how it plays out moving forward. But again, the review for AU vs. the World will be out when it's ready. And sadly, I think this is going to be a similar situation for Big Brother 27. Big Brother 27, same thing when it finishes at the end of the month. Likely, the player ranking will be out immediately like this. However, the actual review of the season will, again, just be out when it's done, which hopefully won't be too far out after the season's finished. But again, we'll just have to see, because again, I haven't started working on it yet. Though, now with AU vs. the World out of the way, I will also eventually, again, we'll see when that video comes out, but be making a ranking of every Australian Survivor player of all time of the Network 10 series, to where, again, that's something I've been planning on making for years, and AU vs. the World kind of messed it up, because I actually was going to do it earlier in the year, but then AU vs. the World's happening. I was like, well, I guess I have to wait for that now. But again, it'll be coming out eventually between now and the next season, so stay tuned for that. And beyond that, obviously, just expect the same style of content for the channel. Just again, consistency is going to be maybe a bit wonky, but either way, that's it for my player ranking of Australian Survivor versus the World. Thank you for watching.